Before we begin, if you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. YouTube does not always make it easy to monetize this kind of content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories for you. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment, and for those who want the continuation of the videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is where you can find it. Thank you so much for your support, and now, let's get into today's story. Have you ever been to a place so incredibly quiet that the silence actually rings in your ears? A place where the trees are so tall they seem to scrape the sky, and the air smells like damp earth, pine needles, and secrets? That's where our story takes place. Deep in the heart of the Blackwood Ridge, a massive, ancient forest, miles and miles away from the noise, the concrete, and the endless rush of the city. It's the kind of place where people go when they want to disappear, or, in some cases, where they go when they're trying to find something they've lost. Elias wasn't trying to find anything. At 28 years old, he was already perfectly content being hidden. He was the head ranger of the northern sector of Blackwood, a man who seemed carved straight out of the very mountains he patrolled. He was tall, with broad shoulders, rough hands from years of chopping wood, and a shadow of dark stubble that never quite went away. His eyes were the color of the forest canopy right before a storm, a deep, intense, watchful green. He was a man of very few words. He preferred the company of the ancient pines, the wolves, and the whispering wind over any human being. Elias had his remote cabin, his thermos of black coffee, and his radio. That was all he needed. That was his entire world. Until a Tuesday, in late October. The weather was already turning bitter, the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks and promises a harsh winter. Elias was at the ranger station at the edge of the reserve, filling out some mandatory, boring paperwork when the door swung open, bringing a gust of freezing wind with it. And in walked Julian. If Elias looked like he belonged to the woods, Julian looked like he had just fallen out of a high-end photography magazine. He was 25, with soft, slightly messy chestnut hair, wearing a sleek, expensive, and completely impractical winter coat. He had a heavy, professional camera slung over his shoulder, and his cheeks were flushed pink from the cold. He looked completely out of his depth. Julian stepped up to the counter, brushing a stray leaf off his shoulder. He looked at Elias, and for a second, time just paused. You know that feeling? When you make eye contact with a stranger, and instead of looking away, something invisible just anchors you there? That's what happened. Julian's eyes were a warm, honey brown, and as they met Elias's dark, guarded gaze, a sudden, almost heavy tension dropped into the room. Julian cleared his throat, breaking the spell. He offered a polite, slightly nervous smile. "Hi, I'm looking for the trailhead to the Weeping Hollows. I have a permit to photograph the native flora there." Elias just stared at him. He slowly put his pen down, crossing his thick arms over his flannel-clad chest. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a deep, gravelly rumble. "The Weeping Hollows are a 12-mile hike up the ridge," Elias said, his tone flat, unimpressed. "The trails are muddy, the temperature is dropping, and there's a severe storm warning for tonight. You're not going up there." Julian's smile faltered, replaced by a stubborn tightness around his lips. "I have a permit," he repeated, reaching into his pocket and placing a crumpled paper on the counter. "I'm a botanical researcher. I've come all the way from the city, just to document a rare blooming cycle that only happens this week. I know what I'm doing." Elias looked at the paper, then looked at Julian's boots. They were designer boots. Clean, not a speck of mud on them. "Those boots won't last a mile on the ridge," Elias said softly. "Go back to the city, kid. The forest doesn't care about your permit." Julian's jaw clenched. He wasn't a kid. He was an adult who was fighting desperately to save his failing career in the city, under the thumb of a toxic university department that was constantly setting him up to fail. This photography trip was his last chance to prove himself. He wasn't going to let a grumpy, giant lumberjack of a ranger tell him no. Without another word, Julian snatched his permit back, shot Elias a glaring look, and turned on his heel. "I'll find it myself. Thanks for nothing." Elias watched him walk out, shaking his head. He should have stopped him physically. He knew he should have. But part of him thought the city boy would walk half a mile, get his fancy boots ruined in the mud, and turn right back around. He was wrong. 4 hours later, the sky didn't just turn dark, it turned black. The wind began to howl, violently tearing through the trees, and then the rain came. It wasn't normal rain. It was a torrential, freezing, blinding downpour. The temperature plummeted. Inside his warm, secluded cabin miles up the mountain, Elias was tossing another log into the fireplace. The fire crackled, casting a warm orange glow over the wooden walls. He poured himself a mug of coffee, listening to the rain violently lash against his windows. Suddenly, his radio crackled to life with static. "Ranger station to Elias. Do you copy?" Elias pressed the button on his receiver. "Copy. What's going on down there?" "We've got an abandoned car at the base of the Weeping Hollows trail. Belongs to a Julian Thorne. He signed the trail register 4 hours ago and hasn't signed out. The roads at the bottom of the mountain are already washing out. We can't get a team up there." Elias felt his stomach drop. His chest tightened with a sudden icy grip. That stubborn, foolish boy with the honey-brown eyes was out there. In designer boots and a city coat. In freezing, torrential rain, with night falling. "I'll find him," Elias said, his voice surprisingly tight. He didn't wait for a response. He threw down his radio, grabbed his heavy waterproof gear, his high-powered flashlight, and his medical kit, and threw himself out into the raging storm. The forest in a storm is a terrifying place. Trees groan and snap, the ground turns into a sliding trap of mud and roots, and the sound of the wind is deafening. Elias knew these woods like the back of his hand, but even he had to fight against the sheer force of nature. He tracked the trail, sweeping his flashlight beam through the blinding rain. "Julian!" he roared, his voice nearly swallowed by the thunder. "Julian!" For 2 agonizing hours, there was nothing, just rain, mud, and darkness. Elias's heart began to beat with a heavy, frantic rhythm. He was a professional. He had done search and rescues before, but for some reason, the thought of that specific man, shivering and alone in the dark, made his chest ache with a kind of panic he wasn't used to. And then, he saw it. A flash of a silver camera tripod discarded in the mud. Elias scrambled down a steep, slippery embankment. Tucked beneath the hollowed-out roots of a massive, fallen cedar tree was a huddled figure. It was Julian. He was curled into a tight ball, his arms wrapped around his knees. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive coat heavy and useless with water. He was shivering so violently that his teeth were audibly chattering, and his skin was a terrifying shade of pale. Elias dropped to his knees in the mud beside him, throwing his flashlight down. "Julian," he breathed out, his massive hands reaching out to grip Julian's shoulders. Julian flinched, his eyes slowly fluttering open. He looked dazed, disoriented by the cold. When he saw Elias's face illuminated by the scattered beam of the flashlight, his trembling lips parted. "Ranger," he whispered, his voice incredibly weak. "I've got you," Elias said. The roughness in his voice was completely gone, replaced by a deep, frantic softness. "I've got you. You're going to be okay." Without a second of hesitation, Elias ripped off his own heavy, insulated, waterproof jacket. He wrapped it tightly around Julian's shivering, fragile frame. The coat dwarfed Julian, but it provided immediate, life-saving warmth. Julian was too weak to walk. His ankle was twisted, and hypothermia was setting in. "Put your arms around my neck," Elias commanded gently. Julian, too exhausted to argue, weakly draped his arms over Elias's broad, muscular shoulders. He buried his freezing face into the crook of Elias's neck. Elias could feel Julian's cold breath against his skin, and a strange, sudden, fierce wave of protectiveness washed over him. He scooped Julian up into his arms, holding him tightly against his chest, as easily as if Julian weighed nothing at all. "Hold on to me," Elias whispered into the storm. And then he began the grueling hike up the mountain, carrying Julian all the way to his cabin. When Elias finally kicked the cabin door open, the sudden warmth of the room felt like a miracle. He quickly kicked the door shut against the howling wind and carried Julian straight over to the large, worn leather sofa in front of the roaring fireplace. He set Julian down gently. Julian was still shivering, his eyes half closed, clutching Elias's oversized jacket around himself. "You need to get out of those wet clothes right now," Elias said, his voice urgent but calm. "Your core temperature is too low. You're going to freeze to death if you sit in those." Julian looked up at him, his honey-brown eyes wide, vulnerable, and a little bit embarrassed. My hands," he stammered, his fingers trembling so badly he couldn't even grasp the zipper of his shirt. "I can't." Elias knelt in front of him. He looked up, his deep green eyes meeting Julian's. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet, steady reassurance. "Can I help you?" Elias asked softly. Julian swallowed hard, feeling a sudden flutter in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He gave a tiny, trembling nod. Elias reached out. His large, rough hands were remarkably gentle. He unzipped Julian's wet layers, carefully peeling away the soaked fabric. He tried to keep his eyes respectful, focused only on the task, but he couldn't help noticing how beautiful Julian was. The smooth, pale skin of his shoulders, the delicate line of his collarbone, shivering in the firelight. Elias quickly grabbed a thick, heated woolen blanket from the rack near the fire and wrapped it securely around Julian's bare shoulders, pulling it tight. He then brought out a pair of his own oversized, soft sweatpants and a thick, heavy sweater. "Put these on under the blanket," Elias muttered, suddenly feeling a strange heat creeping up his own neck. He turned around, giving Julian privacy, pretending to stoke the fire. The silence in the cabin was suddenly very loud, save for the crackling of the wood and the storm raging outside. Elias could hear the rustle of fabric as Julian dressed. "I'm decent," Julian said softly. Elias turned back. Julian looked ridiculously small in Elias's clothes. The sweater sleeves completely swallowed his hands, and the collar hung loosely off one shoulder. But his color was returning. He looked warm. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He walked over to the small kitchen area, poured a fresh, steaming mug of coffee, and walked back, wrapping Julian's cold hands around the warm ceramic. "Drink," Elias ordered softly. Julian took a slow sip. He looked up at Elias, who was now just wearing his thermal shirt, completely soaked from the rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. "You're freezing too," Julian noted, his voice gaining a little strength. "You gave me your coat." "I'm used to it," Elias dismissed, running a hand through his wet hair. "Thank you," Julian whispered, the stubbornness from earlier completely gone. He looked down at the mug. "You warned me. I was stupid. I couldn't go back to the city empty-handed. I had to prove I could do this." Elias sat on the heavy wooden coffee table directly in front of Julian. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking directly into Julian's eyes. "There's nothing out there worth dying for, Julian," Elias said, his voice low, intimate, and impossibly deep. "Not a photograph, not a job." Julian looked at him, feeling the intense weight of Elias's gaze. "Maybe not," Julian replied softly. "But sitting here, I think I'm glad I didn't turn back right away." The air between them suddenly felt very thick. Elias's eyes flickered down to Julian's lips for a fraction of a second before he caught himself. He stood up abruptly, clearing his throat. I'll get some dry clothes on. You stay by the fire." As Elias walked into his bedroom, Julian watched his broad back, feeling a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't just the fire. And just a small reminder, if you want more story continuations, bonus scenes, early access, and uncensored 18+ BL content just like this, you can support me on SpicyTimeBL. The link is in the description and pinned comment. Now, let's get back to the cabin. When morning came, the storm hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. Elias stood by the window, holding his radio. Nothing but dead static. He looked over his shoulder. Julian was still asleep on the sofa, curled up under the thick blankets, his face peaceful in the soft gray morning light. Elias couldn't look away. For a man who valued his isolation above everything else, Elias suddenly found that having this man in his space didn't feel intrusive at all. It felt right. When Julian finally woke up, he groaned, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Is it still raining?" "Roads are completely washed out," Elias said, walking over and handing him a plate of eggs and toast. "We're completely cut off. No radio signal, no way down the mountain. You're stuck here with me for at least a few days." Julian took the plate, looking up at Elias. "Are you going to be okay with that, Mr. Lone Wolf?" A tiny, rare smirk played at the corner of Elias's lips. "I think I'll survive." The next 3 days felt like they existed in a completely separate universe. Outside, the world was a chaotic, freezing nightmare. Inside, the small wooden cabin, a quiet, intense, and incredibly domestic routine began to form. They were forced into close proximity. The cabin only had 2 rooms. They bumped shoulders in the tiny kitchen while making coffee. They sat mere inches apart on the sofa at night, the fire illuminating their faces as they talked. Julian, naturally curious and a bit talkative, began to slowly chip away at Elias's hardened exterior. He learned that Elias had moved to the woods to escape a loud, demanding family that never understood him. He learned that Elias loved the quiet because it was the only time his mind felt at peace. And Elias learned about Julian. He learned about the intense pressure Julian put on himself, the fear of failure, the ex-boyfriend who had told Julian he was too soft for the harsh world of fieldwork. Every time Julian mentioned his ex, Elias felt a strange, dark twist of something entirely new in his gut: jealousy. A fierce, possessive anger on behalf of a man he had only known for 3 days. How could anyone look at Julian, so passionate, so bright, so stubbornly brave, and tell him he wasn't enough? On the 3rd evening, Julian was sitting by the fire, holding his twisted ankle, wincing slightly. Elias, who had been reading a book across the room, noticed immediately. He closed his book, walked over, and knelt down on the rug right in front of Julian. "Let me see," Elias murmured. "It's fine, really," Julian said, though his breath hitched slightly as Elias gently took his bare foot into his large, warm hands. "I told you. I'm the ranger. You're in my jurisdiction," Elias said, his voice a soft, teasing rumble. He gently rolled up the hem of Julian's oversized sweatpants, exposing the bruised ankle. Elias's thumbs carefully, tenderly traced the sensitive skin. The contrast was striking. Elias's deeply tanned, calloused, strong hands holding Julian's pale, delicate ankle. Julian couldn't breathe. Every place Elias touched him felt like it was sparking with electricity. He looked down at Elias. He looked at the thick lashes framing his dark green eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the gentle way he handled him. as if Julian was made of glass. Elias looked up. Their faces were only inches apart. The silence in the cabin suddenly changed. It wasn't the comfortable, friendly silence they had shared all day. It was heavy. It was charged. It was the kind of silence that happens right before everything changes. Elias's thumb slowly stopped moving on Julian's skin. His gaze drifted from Julian's eyes down to his lips, and he stayed there. He didn't move away, he just knelt there, breathing slowly, his hands resting warmly on Julian's leg. "Does that hurt?" Elias whispered, his voice dangerously low. "No," Julian breathed back, his voice trembling just a little, not at all. For a second, it looked like Elias was going to lean in. He leaned forward, just a fraction of an inch. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. But then, a loud gust of wind rattled the cabin windows, breaking the tension like glass. Elias blinked, pulling back quickly, clearing his throat and standing up. "Keep weight off it," he muttered gruffly, turning his back and walking quickly to the kitchen. Julian sat there, his ankle still burning with the phantom warmth of Elias's touch, realizing with a sudden, overwhelming clarity that he was falling for the forest ranger. By the fourth day, the storm finally broke. The sun came out, piercing through the canopy of the massive pines. The forest was transformed into a glittering, wet, beautiful wonderland. Julian was thrilled. Despite his ankle, he hobbled out onto the cabin's wraparound wooden porch with his camera. He spent an hour taking photos of the mist rising from the trees, the water droplets clinging to the pine needles. Elias was chopping firewood in the yard. The physical exertion had him in just a white undershirt, his muscles flexing and straining with every swing of the heavy axe. Sweat glistened on his neck. Julian slowly lowered his camera from the trees and aimed the lens at Elias. Through the viewfinder, he watched the raw power, the quiet masculinity, the absolute beauty of this man who had saved his life. Julian adjusted the focus, capturing the sharp line of Elias's profile against the backdrop of the wild forest. Click, click. Elias heard the shutter. He paused, resting the axe on the block, and turned to look at the porch. He hated having his picture taken. Usually, he would have growled and told someone to put the camera away. But looking at Julian, leaning against the wooden railing, the morning sun catching the golden hues in his brown eyes, Elias couldn't bring himself to stop him. He just stood there, looking back, letting Julian truly see him. Julian lowered the camera slowly. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look on his face, the soft, reverent, completely unguarded adoration in his eyes, spoke volumes. Elias felt his heart skip a beat. He dropped the axe and slowly walked up the steps onto the porch. He stopped right in front of Julian. The smell of fresh pine and rain clung to him. "Did you get your shot?" Elias asked softly. Julian looked up into those intense green eyes. "Yeah," Julian whispered. "I got the most beautiful thing in the forest." Elias swallowed hard. The space between them evaporated. Elias reached out, his hand hesitating for a second before his rough fingers gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind Julian's ear. The touch was so tender it made Julian's breath hitch. Suddenly, from inside the cabin, the radio blasted a loud burst of static. Both men jumped, the spell broken. "Hello? Hello? Is this the Northern Ranger station? Do you have Julian Thorne?" The voice was arrogant, sharp, and annoying. Julian's face immediately fell. He recognized that voice. It was Marcus, his ex-boyfriend and the lead coordinator of his department. Elias saw the way Julian flinched, the way his shoulders slumped, all the light draining from his eyes. Elias's jaw clenched tightly. He walked into the cabin, picking up the radio receiver. "This is Ranger Elias," he answered, his voice cold and authoritative. "Oh, thank God," Marcus's voice crackled. "Listen, put Julian on. I need to know if he got the photos. If he didn't, his funding is getting pulled by tomorrow. I told him he wasn't cut out for this kind of field work. Is he crying in a corner somewhere?" Julian stood in the doorway of the porch, looking down at his feet, shame painting his cheeks red. He hated that Elias had to hear this. He hated that he was being talked down to like a child. Elias looked at Julian. He saw the beautiful, brave, stubborn man who had survived a freezing storm, who had brightened this dark cabin with his laughter, who had looked at Elias like he was someone worth loving. Elias pressed the button on the radio. His voice was dangerously calm, carrying the heavy weight of a deadly threat. "Listen to me very carefully," Elias growled into the mic. "Julian is the bravest, most capable man I have ever met. He survived a Category 4 mountain storm that would have killed a lesser man. Your funding doesn't matter. Your opinion doesn't matter. If you ever speak about him with that tone of voice again, you'll have to come up this mountain and deal with me. Do you understand?" Dead silence on the other end of the radio. Then, a small, intimidated squeak. Yes, understood. Just tell him the rescue crew will clear the roads by tomorrow morning." Elias turned the radio off, completely off. He set it down on the table. Julian was staring at him, his mouth slightly open, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. No one had ever defended him like that. No one had ever stood up for him, protected him, believed in him the way Elias just had. Elias walked slowly across the room, stopping right in front of Julian. He reached out, taking both of Julian's hands in his. His thumbs gently stroked Julian's knuckles. "You don't have to go back," Elias said softly, his voice full of a quiet, desperate pleading that he had never used in his entire life. "You don't have to go back to people who don't see how incredible you are." Julian looked up, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "If I don't go back, where do I go?" Elias took a deep breath. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure Julian could hear it. He let go of one of Julian's hands, bringing his rough, warm palm up to cup Julian's cheek. He gently wiped the tear away with his thumb. "Stay," Elias whispered, the word hanging in the quiet air of the cabin like a prayer. "Stay with me." Julian's breath shuddered. He leaned his face into Elias's palm, closing his eyes, feeling the absolute safety, the absolute warmth of this man's touch. "Here?" he whispered. "In the middle of nowhere?" "It's not nowhere," Elias murmured, stepping even closer until their chests were almost touching. "It's somewhere. If you're here." "Julian, I've been alone for a very long time. I thought I wanted it that way, but the thought of you getting in a car tomorrow and driving down that mountain, it's tearing me apart." Julian opened his eyes. He saw the vulnerability, the raw, beautiful honesty in Elias's deep green eyes. The tall, stoic ranger was laying his entire heart on the line. "I don't want to leave," Julian confessed, his voice breaking. He reached up, his fingers gripping the front of Elias's shirt. "I don't care about the city, I don't care about the job, I just want you." Elias let out a shaky exhale, a sound of absolute relief. He didn't wait another second. He slid his hand to the back of Julian's neck, tangling his fingers in Julian's soft chestnut hair, and he pulled him in. When their lips met, it wasn't a hesitant, timid kiss. It was a collision of everything they had been holding back for 4 days. It was the heat of the fire, the desperation of the storm, the quiet longing of two people who had finally found exactly what they were looking for. Elias kissed him deeply, passionately, his other arm wrapping tightly around Julian's waist, pulling him flush against his body. Julian gasped softly against his lips, his hands instantly sliding up Elias's broad shoulders, wrapping around his neck, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. The kiss was soft but demanding. It was a promise. Elias tilted his head, deepening the kiss, tasting the sweetness of Julian, feeling the way Julian melted completely into his embrace, trusting him entirely. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Elias rested his forehead against Julian's, his eyes closed, holding him tightly in his arms, feeling the steady, synchronized beating of their hearts. "You're staying," Elias whispered into the space between them, a soft, happy smile finally breaking across his rugged face. Julian smiled back, his eyes shining with pure joy. "I'm staying." And he did. The rescue crew cleared the roads the next morning. Julian went down the mountain, packed his apartment in the city, quit his toxic job, and within a week, his car was driving right back up the ridge. He moved his cameras, his books, and his life into the small wooden cabin. He spent his days photographing the real beauty of the forest, no longer answering to anyone but himself. And Elias was no longer the lonely, silent ranger. He had a reason to smile when he woke up. He had a warm hand to hold when they walked the trails at sunset. He had Julian. Sometimes, getting lost in the worst storm of your life is the only way to find exactly where you are meant to be. Thank you all so much for listening to today's story. If you loved Elias and Julian's journey and want to see more of their life together in the cabin, remember that you can find the continuation of the videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content on my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Your support means the world to me and helps me keep bringing these emotional romances to life. Until next time, take care and stay romantic.